Hello everyone and welcome to this Boosted Films tutorial video. Today we're going to take a look at installing an Innovate Motorsports E-85 ethanol content analyzer gauge, and it's also a fuel temperature gauge. Basically there's two parts to this install. We're going to install the flex fuel sensor and we're going to install the gauge. As always, this video is for entertainment purposes only. The only reason you are watching this video is because you like to hear the sound of my voice and I'm so entertaining. But in all seriousness, when you are playing with anything fuel related on your car, you should be careful and know what you're doing. You could cause some serious issues if you don't pay attention and do things right. So as always, if you are not comfortable with your own abilities, please pay a professional to do it. Again, this really is just showing how I did it. I am not recommending you do it this way. I'm not recommending you do it at all, actually. But if you decide to do it yourself, there is a couple things that are going to help you out. The biggest thing is you're going to want to buy what I have up on the screen here. You're going to want to buy fuel line quick connectors, 2 of them. You're going to want to buy some 1/4-inch fuel line hose. And the length of that hose will kind of depend on where you mount your flex fuel sensor. But you should probably only need about 2 feet. You're also going to need a couple hose clamps for that fuel line hose. You're going to need some wire, anywhere from, I believe, 18 to 26 gauge wire. Shouldn't matter too much on the size, but you'll need probably about 6 feet of wire. That should give you plenty of extra. And then I also recommend getting a mini fuse tap adapter, and we'll get into that shortly. So this is an install on a Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution 8. And we are installing this flex fuel sensor on the return line of this car, as I'm pointing out here, because the return line has less pressure. So that's really the safest way to add this flex fuel sensor. It's not measuring pressure. You don't need to know the fuel line pressure. You're just trying to establish the ethanol content in our fuel. And as I mentioned earlier, the things you'll want to buy are these fuel line quick connectors. For me, it's a 1/4-inch barb to 3/8 inch female elbow. It doesn't necessarily need to be the elbow style. It could be straight, but basically you just want that quick connector adapter to reduce down from that 3/8 size to the 1/4-inch size. Otherwise, there's no easy or correct way to make these connections fit right, because you're going from such a small size that's on the car itself. Right now, it's basically a 1/4-inch fuel line size on the car, but then the connector to that flex fuel sensor is about 3/8. So that's quite a bit bigger, and that's why you want to make sure you buy these quick connectors. And you'll also, again, want to buy that fuel line hose. I just bought a 25-foot length because I thought it would be good to have, but you probably, again, will only need about 2 feet. And then for actually wiring up the gauge, I just recommend you buy this mini fuse tap adapter, so you can just plug it into your fuse panel. That'll just make things a lot easier. And then you also, again, want to buy some wire so you can run wire from that fuse tap up to your gauge. So there are basically 2 steps to installing and getting this gauge working properly. One is actually installing the gauge. So what we're going to do here is run the wire through our firewall that actually connects to the flex fuel sensor. So we're going to pull that in and run it inside the car up to our gauge. Where you go with this is totally up to you. I cannot specifically tell you, this is going to depend on your gauge setup. I have the 3 gauge setup where the radio normally is. So this is the 3rd gauge I'm adding in. So I'm just getting this gauge mounted in place after I had the wire ran in. And then if you look at the Innovate owner's manual, basically it will show you and tell you what gauges you need to connect. And realistically, the only wires you need to connect for this gauge to work is an ignition wire. You will connect to power it, and the gauge only needs power when the car is on. It doesn't have a memory function. It doesn't need constant power. It only needs to receive power when the car turns on. So that's actually the ignition. And if you go inside the car, driver's side kick panel, you should be able to pull out this little cubby here, and then behind it you'll see the interior fuse box. And then what you'll see is I actually tapped in with that mini fuse tap I talked about earlier, and I tapped into fuse number 13 for the radio. And again, because that one only comes on when the ignition comes on. So I'm not showing exactly how to do all that stuff, as I don't think that's the most valuable thing for you. But realistically, I think you just want to know where to tap into. And then the only other wire that you need to actually get this gauge to work is obviously your ground. So then you're going to want to run a ground wire to the gauge as well. Basically, once you have connected those two wires, the ignition wire and the ground, and you have your gauge mounted, you should be pretty much all set. There's just one other wire you'll want to plug into the back of the gauge, and that wire is going to run to the flex fuel sensor itself. So on to installing the actual flex fuel sensor. Again, I already pointed out we're going to attach it to the fuel return line of this EVO. And just to make things easier, I'm going to remove the strut tower bar here so I have easier access and better visibility to that fuel return line. And once that strut tower bar is out of the way, you can see these fuel lines a little bit easier. There is the feed line basically running fuel up and in to the fuel rail. And then here again, I'm holding the return line. And this is basically the return line is what we're going to tap into, add that flex fuel sensor. And since these fuel lines looked a little old, probably the original, I basically pulled off this return line entirely and just added new hose. So what you're going to want to do is remove the clamps going from that hard line to the hose, and you're going to have to take the clamp off down there. And again, when you're working with anything with fuel, it will be under pressure, not a lot of pressure, but be ready for some fuel to come out. So it's always good to wear safety glasses when you're working with any fuel, and you obviously don't want to be around anything that could ignite fuel or anything like that. And now I'm just going to show where that return line comes down and around into the connector. This is actually kind of a mock-up setup. This is before I had the quick release connections to put it on. And just an example of why you want to make sure you get those connectors. You can see how big that hose is that I'm pulling off the line. Like, that's not a good fit. And basically just an example here to show you why you want to make sure you have the right fuel size hose. This 1/4-inch hose that I'm putting on here, you can see fits much better. So this 1/4-inch hose is going to run to those adapters we bought. And as I'm showing here, we're going to plug this 1/4-inch hose into the adapters, the quick release adapters. And then what happens is those quick release adapters just end up plugging right into that flex fuel E-85 sensor. And of course, you're going to want to put a hose clamp on where those barb connections go with that fuel line. Just tighten that down before we click it in place on the flex fuel sensor. I do not believe direction mattered. I couldn't find anything on the flex fuel sensor for talking about fuel flow direction, so I don't think the direction matters on which end you connect it to. As always, check the video description if there are any changes, or if I did anything wrong, check the video description or the comments for corrections. So we're going to plug this in. Now that we have those lines set up, again, we had about a foot of fuel line, 1/4-inch fuel line on each side. So we're going to plug those in to the flex fuel sensor, and then we're going to plug in the electrical wire itself and plug that into the flex fuel sensor here. And then basically you're going to want to reconnect the other ends of the hoses. So one end of the hose is going to run down to that hard line, going back to the fuel tank. You'll connect that, and then the other end runs up towards the fuel rail, and you'll connect that as well. And then once you have those fuel lines connected, you should be able to mount your flex fuel sensor. Hopefully you kind of plan it out a little bit first as to where you wanted to mount it and how you wanted to mount it, but I will leave that entirely up to you. So after you've checked everything over and everything looks good, you're obviously going to want to do a test. So you're going to start your car up and check for fuel leaks. And here you can just see how I have the quick connectors ran and how mine is currently mounted up. And here you can see the gauge is showing my ethanol content percentage. So that's about it for this Boosted Films tutorial video. Again, please take caution when you're working with anything fuel related. This is just a video showing how I installed my ethanol gauge. And I am always open to new, better ideas, and I want to know what I did wrong, because that's what the internet is for. So please, if I did anything wrong, leave it in the comments. Tell me, let me know. Continue the conversation. Overall, my goal here is really just to have people more prepared for when they would try to do something like this on their own. And part of what is going to help with that is actually people comment, let me know about how you did yours. Let me know if there's a different solution. Let me know if there's a better way you think I did it. Let me know if there's something that I've done completely wrong that I should fix. Because again, this is just me and how I did my install, and it's hard to update video content. So watch the description of this video and read the comment section to learn more. And hopefully you found this helpful. If not, hopefully you found it mildly entertaining. And as always, thanks so much for watching.